Okay, let's get into our first story called Doctor Who. In 1974, Jean-Claude Ramond enrolled in medical school in Lyon, France. He was a model student who excelled despite the notoriously brutal course load. In 1980, he married his girlfriend and, shortly after that, they had 2 kids, a boy and a girl. In 1983, he officially became a doctor and landed a great job as a researcher at the World Health Organization in Geneva. His focus was on finding new medicines to treat arteriosclerosis, also known as heart disease. His wife would proudly tell her friends that her husband was a super doctor who worked quietly in a neon-lit lab in Geneva to develop all these incredible treatments. From the outside looking in, Jean-Claude's life looked perfect, but looks can be deceiving. In the early morning hours of Monday, January 11th, 1993, Jean-Claude's best friend, Luke, received a call informing him there had been a terrible accident in the night. A boiler had caught fire inside of Jean-Claude's house, killing his wife and his children. Jean-Claude had barely escaped alive, but when he got to the hospital, he had slipped into a coma. The 2 men had been friends for nearly 20 years. They were both doctors. They both got married at almost the exact same time. Their kids had grown up together. And now, Jean-Claude's family had been completely destroyed. Later that day, when Luke arrived at the hospital to see his friend, he was met with 2 policemen standing outside of his room, barring anyone from going inside. And when they realized Luke was his best friend, the policeman said, "Hey, can we actually pull you aside and talk to you about Jean-Claude?" And so Luke was confused, but he walked over and sat at a table with the 2 officers, and they proceeded to tell him that the fire that had killed Jean-Claude's family had not been an accident, and Jean-Claude was not a doctor. Jean-Claude had enrolled in medical school in Lyon back in the 1972, but he failed to show up for his first-year exam. And without passing that exam, you can't advance in medical school. And so the school allowed him to retake the year. And so Jean-Claude did that for 12 consecutive years while he told his friends and family that he was following normal medical studies. And eventually, he told them he had become a doctor. Instead of going to Geneva to discover new medicines for heart disease, Jean-Claude would duck around the border area between France and Switzerland and periodically go to the World Health Organization's Public Information Center, and would just walk around the lobby and read pamphlets before going home again. When Jean-Claude went on overseas business trips, he would actually just leave his house, hop on the highway, and stop at a motel. He'd stay there for a couple of days and then return with gifts. He lived off money from the sale of his student apartment in Lyon that his parents had bought for him. When the money ran out, he asked his friends and family to give him their life savings so he could invest them into these schemes that he knew about because he was an unemployed. And because he's a very successful, reputable doctor, people agreed and gave him their money. But by late 1992, some of his victims were asking for their money and he didn't have it. And so some of these people began doing some research on Jean-Claude, and they found his name was not listed on the World Health Organization staff list. By January of 1993, Jean-Claude knew it was only a matter of time before he was exposed. And to this point, he has been living this life for almost 20 years. His wife, his kids, his friends, his parents, everybody he has told that he's the successful doctor, and that's all about to come crashing down. And the way he handles it is, he drives to his parents' house and he kills his parents and their dog, and then drives back to his house and kills his family, takes sleeping pills, and then lights the house on fire. But firefighters were able to get to him and pull him out before he could take his own life. And so, after he regained his strength, he was taken into custody and he made a confession. He was convicted of murder in 1996 and given a life sentence. But in 2015, he became eligible for parole, and in 2019, he was released. Our next story is called Drunk. In October of 2014, a 35-year-old woman who we'll call Olivia met her husband for lunch at a restaurant in Western New York. The couple had not originally planned to stay at this restaurant for very long, but one thing led to another. They were having a nice time, and before long, it was 6. p.m. and they had been there for 6 hours. And over those 6 hours, both of them had had a lot to eat. Lots of bread and pasta and cakes and all sorts of stuff. And they had had some alcohol, but not very much. Olivia had been careful to only have her drinks over those 6 hours because she wanted to be able to drive, and her husband similarly limited his drinking so he'd be safe to drive. And so, after they got the check and they paid for their meal, they both hopped in their respective cars and they began driving home. As Olivia was making her way home, she unfortunately got a flat tire. And so she pulled off to the side of the road and she called roadside assistance. As she was waiting for help to show up, another motorist happened to drive by and they misunderstood what was happening. They saw Olivia standing outside of her car with the tire popped off, and they thought she'd been in an accident, and so they called the police and reported it. And so the police show up a few minutes later. They pull up right behind Olivia, and when they get out, they ask her, are you okay? Do you need any help? And she would say, oh no, I just had a flat tire. I'm totally fine. Thank you for stopping though. But the police, as they're listening to her speak, they see her eyes look kind of glassy and glazed over, like she's drunk. And as she was speaking, they could have sworn she was slurring her words. And so they said, hey ma'am, have you been drinking tonight? And she would tell them that, well yeah, I have had a few drinks, but only for over the last 6 hours. And I don't feel drunk at all. That has nothing to do with the situation I'm in now. I'm not drunk. But the police were not buying it. And so they put her through a series of field sobriety tests that she managed to get through, but she struggled with enough that it sent up some red flags. And so they made her blow into a breathalyzer. A breathalyzer is a device that uses your breath to register how much alcohol is in your system, also known as your blood alcohol content, or BAC for short. BAC is scored as a percentage out of 100. And while no one should ever get behind the wheel of a vehicle if they are impaired, it is the case that in America, you are allowed legally to operate a vehicle if your BAC is 8% or lower. For reference, if a 160-pound female consumed about 3 alcoholic drinks, maybe a little bit more, in the course of an hour, she would most likely have a 8% BAC. If that same 160-pound female were to consume, let's say, 8 alcoholic drinks over the course of an hour, she would definitely not be allowed to legally operate a vehicle because she would be very, very drunk. Her BAC would have spiked to 2%, which would put her in the range where she would most likely have alcohol poisoning and eventually she would most likely lose consciousness. If this same 160-pound female were to consume 13 alcoholic drinks over the course of an hour, her BAC would jump all the way up to 4%, where she's not just drunk and unable to operate a vehicle. At that level, you're talking about potentially dying from consuming that much alcohol. When Olivia blew into this breathalyzer, she fully expected that she would be below the 8% legal limit because, after all, she'd only had 4 alcoholic drinks over a 6-hour period, and so that would put her well below that legal limit. But that was not the case. She blew a staggering 33%. The cops couldn't believe what they were looking at because they're looking at Olivia and they're thinking, at that level, she should be somewhere between losing consciousness and dying. But here she is, just standing there talking to us, acting a little bit buzzed, and so they assumed their breathalyzer must have made a mistake. So they went back into their car, got another breathalyzer, did it again, and again. Olivia blew 33% BAC. The officers couldn't understand how this woman had such an extreme alcohol tolerance, but regardless, they charged her with driving while intoxicated and then brought her to the hospital for medical intervention. There, her BAC remained high even after a full day had passed without her consuming any more alcohol. This is around the time that it was discovered that Olivia had a very, very rare medical condition called auto-brewery syndrome, which, in a nutshell, meant her body transformed glucose from foods, specifically carbs like bread, pasta, that kind of thing, into alcohol. Olivia, who was totally unaware of this condition, had developed this wicked alcohol tolerance because she was basically drunk all the time, not because she was a heavy drinker, but because she ate carbs. This condition, if left untreated, can do the same damage alcoholism and binge drinking can do to the body. The only way you can treat it is by drastically changing your diet. When Olivia's condition was discovered and made public, the charges against her were dropped, and she would go on to just stop eating carbs altogether. The next and final story of today's episode is called Identical Strangers. In 1980, Bobby Shaffern was on his way up to Sullivan County Community College, which is 2 hours outside of New York City, to begin his freshman year. Even though he was from the area, he didn't know anybody that was going to this particular school, and so he was pretty nervous about it. Plus, he wasn't that popular in high school and he had a hard time making friends. When he pulled into a parking spot at the school, he saw a sea of people getting out of their parents' cars and carrying boxes up to their dorm rooms. And so he took a deep breath, hopped out of his car, grabbed his backpack, and began walking across the lawn towards the dorm building. On his walk over, Bobby was surprised when he felt like all these random strangers on the lawn were looking at him like they knew him. And a couple of people yelled out to him and said, "Hey, it's good to have you back here, Earl." And one girl actually ran up to him and kissed him on the cheek and said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so happy you're back." And Bobby said, "I think you got the wrong person. I don't know you." And she laughed and she just ran away. And so Bobby's totally bewildered by this because he doesn't know anybody, but everybody seems to know him. And so he walks up the steps and he goes inside the dorm building. And as he's walking down the hall, people are high-fiving him on the patting him on the back. And then right as he's about to turn the corner towards his actual dorm room, someone down the hall behind him yells out, "Hey, Eddie, what's going on, man?" And Bobby knew whoever it was yelling at him. Because this whole situation had been so weird, he felt like this had to be a case of mistaken identity. And so Bobby turned around and he saw, at the other end of the hall, another student who he didn't know clearly waving at him and yelling out, "Hey, Eddie, come here. What's going on, man?" And so Bobby walks up to him and says, "Hey, I'm not Eddie. I don't know what's going on, but everybody thinks I'm somebody that I'm not. But I'm not Eddie. Who's Eddie?" And the guy said, "Yeah, okay, Eddie. It's good to have you back here, man," and then walked off. And so Bobby's like, "What is going on here?" And so Bobby turns and he goes back up to his dorm room. And he goes inside and he just shuts the door. And he's thinking, "I just want to be left alone for a second because this is not right. This is not how a freshman who doesn't know anyone gets welcomed at any school or any place in the world. This is totally unusual." And just a couple of minutes after being inside of his dorm room, he hears a knock on the door. And Bobby's like, "Oh great, who is it now? Who is it that thinks I'm someone I'm not?" So he opens the door and there's another student who he doesn't know who's standing there. And this guy, his face just drains of color and he starts shaking when he sees Bobby. And they're both looking at each other like, "What's going on here?" And the student says to Bobby, "Were you adopted?" And Bobby said, "Yeah." And then the student said, "Is your birthday July 12th?" And Bobby said, "Yeah." And so the student goes, "Okay, my name is Michael, and I am best friends with a guy named Eddie Galland, and you are his clone. You have got to be his identical twin." At this point to Bobby, this almost made sense, but it was so crazy to imagine having some identical twin he didn't know about. And so Bobby asked Michael if he could go meet Eddie, cause he's got to be a student here. And Michael said, "Well, actually, Eddie decided not to come back to school this year, which is probably why everyone you talked to was so excited to see you, because they love Eddie and they thought you were him. And so they're psyched to have you back." After talking for a couple of minutes, Michael tells Bobby that they have to go call Eddie and they have to set up a meeting so that Bobby can meet Eddie and vice versa. And so Michael and Bobby run outside to a payphone booth. They hop inside, they're crammed in there, and they dial up Eddie. And as soon as Eddie answers, Bobby grabs the phone and just says, "Hey Eddie, my name's Bobby and everybody thinks I'm you." And then Eddie says, "Yeah, I've been getting a lot of calls about that too." And Bobby would later say that when he first heard Eddie's voice, he said it sounded like his own voice coming through the phone. And so, ultimately, Eddie invited Bobby and Michael to come to his house so that Eddie and Bobby could see if it really was true that they were twins. And so Michael and Bobby hopped in Bobby's car and they sped 2 hours to Eddie's house. And when they got there, it was the middle of the night, and Eddie's house is the only house in this quiet suburb that has all the lights on. And so Michael and Bobby walk up the path towards the front door of Eddie's house, and right as Bobby is about to knock on the door, it flies open and standing in front of Bobby is his exact clone. That's Eddie. And Eddie's looking back at Bobby and he can't believe what he's looking at. They are definitely identical twins, and they both immediately saw that. Michael would say after Bobby and Eddie just stared at each other for about a minute, they just started laughing. It was like they were total strangers, but at the same time, they had this connection. Immediately, they knew they were related. And they were laughing and they hugged and they just stared at each other. And Michael said anytime Bobby would tilt his head, "Ugh," Eddie would mimic it and vice versa. It was like they were looking into a mirror. Shortly after, this story of these two long-lost brothers reconnecting found its way to Newsday, which was a prominent local newspaper in New York, and they decided they would look into it to see if it was really true or not. And so one of the editors had a junior reporter fly out and actually see Bobby and Eddie face to face and see if it was really true that they were, in fact, identical twins. And as soon as this reporter saw them, they knew immediately that, yep, they're related. And so Newsday printed this totally heartwarming fairy tale story about these two long-lost brothers reconnected after all these years. Just cause of a chance, encounter in college. And everybody loved it. But this is where the story went from amazing to truly unbelievable. Friends of another young man living in the New York area named David Kelman began telling David that he had to check out this Newsday article about these long-lost twins because these two twins look exactly like David. Specifically, they said, "You gotta look at these guys' hands. They are just like yours, David." David was known for having these enormous hands, and a lot of the pictures of Bobby and Eddie in the news showed their hands, and they were enormous. And so, David finally picked up a newspaper and looked at a picture of Bobby and Eddie, and sure enough, he was shocked. They looked exactly like him. And then when he read the article, it showed their birthday was July 12th, the same as his, and they were born at the same hospital he was born at. And so, he's thinking, these are too many coincidences. They have to be my brothers. And so David called Eddie's home phone number, and Eddie's mother picked up, and she asked who was calling. And David said, "Hi, my name is David Kelman. I was born July 12th, 1961, and I'm looking at a newspaper article of two identical twins that look just like me, and one of them is your son. I think I'm the missing third twin." After hearing this, Eddie's mom apparently dropped the phone and yelled out, "They're coming out of the woodwork." So Eddie and Bobby went to David's house, and as soon as they walked in and saw David, they knew right away he was one of them. He was the third twin. And apparently, within minutes of meeting each other, they were wrestling and laughing hysterically on the ground. It was like, even though they were strangers, they somehow already knew each other and had an instant connection. David's family members that witnessed this first interaction said it was the most incredible thing they had ever seen, that it was just so wonderful to see these long-lost siblings finally reconnected after all these years. Shortly after David realized he was the third missing twin, Newsday did another story talking about how there was actually 3 missing twins that had all been reconnected. And once again, it was just this incredible Cinderella story, and now this story went all over the world. They were on the cover of every magazine, every newspaper. They were on every talk show, and everybody had the same question: what similarities did they discover? And they would say, well, we all wrestled in junior high school and high school and high school. We all smoked the same cigarettes. We like the same food. We have the same taste in women. And on talk shows, when they would answer these questions, it was immediately clear that they all shared the same mannerisms. And on the show, they would routinely interrupt each other and finish each other's sentences. It really was like they were the exact same person despite having been raised completely separate from one another. The boys loved the attention they were getting. They had become international rock stars overnight, and all three of them were immediately so close. They were best friends right away. They moved into an apartment together, they went out partying, they met Madonna. It was just this incredible time in their lives. And so, they weren't asking questions about why they had been separated in the first place. But their parents were asking a lot of questions, because they had not been told by the adoption agency that the boy they were adopting actually had two identical siblings. They had no idea. So, the boy's adoptive parents reached out to the adoption agency, which was Louise Wise Services. It's based in New York, very prestigious. Basically, the most powerful and wealthy people in New York use this adoption agency if they're going to adopt. And so the parents reached out to them en masse for a meeting so they could get some answers as to why their kids have been separated. And so the parents go to New York, they go into this meeting room with the top brass of Louise Wise Services, and they say, with the top brass of Louise Wise Services, did you separate our sons at birth on purpose? And one of the executives said, yes, we did, because it's really hard to place 3 children into one home. At which point David's adoptive father lashed out and said, that's absolute BS. If you had told me he had 2 identical siblings, I would have taken all 3. But the agency stood by their decision and said, that's the only reason it happened. And so, sorry, that's all we can tell you. And so the parents were very frustrated and felt like there was much more to the story. And in fact, they felt like the agency was actually lying to them about why they had separated their sons in the first place. But they couldn't get any more information. So they left the agency, and right when they got outside, Bobby's father realized he had left his umbrella inside of the meeting room. And so he turned around, went back inside, walked down the hall quietly so he didn't want to disturb anyone, and he opened the door to the meeting room. And he reached in to get his umbrella, and he looked inside, and he saw the people he had just met with from Louise Wise Services had just opened a bottle of champagne, and they were laughing and smiling, and they were clearly toasting each other on a job well done. And even though Bobby's father did not go in there and confront them about what they were celebrating, he got the sense that they were celebrating having dodged a bullet, that they, clearly, had just lied to the families of these 3 triplets and they'd gotten away with it. And so, between the parents' general sense that the agency was clearly hiding something and then Bobby discovering the champagne toast as soon as they left, the parents decided they needed to get in touch with some lawyers to help them get to the bottom of why their sons had been separated. And so, initially, a number of really prestigious law firms in New York were excited to take this case. But shortly after, they all contacted the families to say, well, actually there's a conflict and we can't do it anymore. And the parents believe this was because the adoption agency, Louise Wise Services, and some of their more prominent and powerful clients were pressuring the lawyers not to dig into this, that clearly there was some secret that they did not want uncovered. And so, unfortunately, the parents hit a dead end and didn't know where else to turn to try to get more information. And so, over time, they kind of just accepted that this is just the way it is. And as for their sons, they didn't really care that much, because the way they looked at it, at least they had each other now. And so, over the years, the boys continued to stay really close. They started families of their own and had lots of family get-togethers. It was just a really happy time in all of their lives. And at some point, the boys actually went into business together and opened their own restaurant in New York called Triplets. And the first year, it was extremely successful. Did over $1 million in revenue. But in the second year, the brothers started to fight with each other about how to run the restaurant. And in many ways, this was their first major conflict. They hadn't grown up together. They had never really fought. And so now they're fighting over money and how to run the business. And it got really bad really quick, and they just could not come to any sort of compromise. And so, at some point, Bobby left the business. He said, I don't want to do this with you guys anymore. And apparently, his departure just completely ruined the dynamic of the 3 brothers. Eddie was the most affected by this fracture in their relationships. All he wanted was for his brothers to be really close and for their families to spend time together. And now all of that was in jeopardy. And so, Eddie started showing signs of severe depression and was ultimately hospitalized for 3 weeks. And then, shortly after getting out of the hospital, he took his own life. This was beyond devastating for the 2 brothers and the rest of their family. Around this time, a journalist named Lawrence Wright, who had always had a fascination with identical twins, found an obscure scientific article called Psychoanalytic Study of the Child. It detailed a New York-based study about identical twins that were intentionally separated at birth and then given to different adoptive families to be studied. Although it wasn't clear what they were actually studying or why they needed identical twins to do this research. In this article, Lawrence discovered all the babies that had been used in the study came from the same adoption agency, the same one the triplets had come from the Louise Wise Services in New York. And so Lawrence called Bobby and told him that, based on this article, it seems like he and his brothers were used in a scientific study. Bobby and David were totally furious. They felt like they've been treated like lab rats. They also wondered if their being separated at birth had a negative impact on their mental health and that might have contributed to Eddie's depression and untimely death. Lawrence wound up writing an article about this twin study he had discovered, and after he published it, another set of twins found out they had been a part of the study and discovered themselves. These 2 women were also struggling with depression, furthering the idea that the study could have led to irreparable harm to their subjects' mental well-being. At this point, David and Bobby did not expect anybody to be held accountable for this study. Instead, they just hoped to find out why it was done and what they were testing for and what the results were. And so, they began working with Lawrence to try to get those answers. They contacted Louise Wise Services, who did admit that, yes, actually this was part of a study. But they didn't give any information about what the results were or why they did it. And so they did some digging and they discovered the guy in charge of the actual scientific study was this doctor named Peter Newborn, who was this very well-known psychologist in New York. And so, Lawrence managed to get an interview with this doctor, but the doctor basically said, "I won't answer any of your questions and I won't give you any information about this study." And he never published his findings. Right before the doctor died in 2008, he made sure the entire study was put under seal inside of the Yale University archive, so no one could access it until 2066, which has led many people to believe that the reason he set it so far out was to guarantee all of these subjects in this study would have died by the time it was made publicly available, protecting his own legacy and the people that were involved in this study. In the recent documentary called 3 Identical Strangers, Dr. Newbar's personal assistant, a woman by the name of Natasha Joseph Foe, was interviewed and they asked her, can you shed any light on why the study was done, what they were testing for, and what the results were? And she would say that she was not actually part of the study. She was on the periphery, but she was privy to what they were doing. And she said the point of the study was to finally put to bed whether it was nature or nurture that made the person who they ultimately become. Basically, are your surroundings the thing that ultimately makes you who you become? Or is it just your genetic makeup that you're predestined to become a particular person independent of how you were raised? And she said the results were incredible, that basically it has nothing to do with nurture. It's all about your genetic makeup, that we unconsciously trend towards specific behaviors and decisions, but we believe it's free will. We believe we're choosing to do certain things, but in reality, it's basically predetermined. And specifically in the triplets case, Bobby was intentionally placed into a more affluent household where his father was a doctor and his mother was a lawyer. And so they were very well educated, and that was his upbringing. Eddie was placed into a more middle-class family with his father being a teacher and his mom being a stay-at-home mother. And David was put into a low-income household where they were all immigrants. English was a second language, and they just had this very small shop that they owned. And Natasha said the study demonstrated that despite these boys being put into different socioeconomic levels, it had almost no impact on who they ultimately became. She said she doesn't know why the study wasn't published, but she hopes someday it will be. Also in this documentary, a doctor named Lawrence Perlman, who was actually one of the researchers in the study that would actually make house visits to each of the boys' houses as they were growing up under the false pretext that they were there as part of routine follow-up for the adoption agency, went on record. He said that the study was not just about the effects of socioeconomic class. It was really about the effects of different styles of parenting. He said in the triplets case, each of the boys had been placed into their respective households after that household had already adopted another child. And that first child they adopted effectively became the guinea pig for this study, where scientists would come in and they would study this child under the false pretext that they were there just following up for the adoption agency. But really, they were creating a baseline of how do these parents. And then once that baseline was established, then the triplets were sent into their respective homes with the researchers knowing full well how they were each going to be brought up, with the adoptive father being the X factor. Bobby's father, who was a doctor, was rarely around, but he was devoted and loving to his son. David's father, who was the shop owner, was around all the time and adored his son and loved him unconditionally. Eddie's father was a teacher who was around a fair amount, but when he was very strict and rough with Eddie and quick to discipline him, and rarely showed any affection for him. And while Dr. Perlman does not come out and say that Eddie's relationship with his father probably had an effect on him becoming depressed and ultimately taking his life, there are many other people close to this case that believe that's exactly what it was, that David and Bobby had a stable, healthy upbringing and Eddie did not. And so, when he was faced with the crisis of the brothers separating, Eddie couldn't handle it. These same people refute what Natasha said about the findings of the study, that we're all genetically predisposed to become a particular person. They say if that was the case, then why haven't David and Bobby taken their lives? But ultimately, because the study was never published, we won't know for sure why it was done, what they studied, and what the conclusions were. All we have is speculation and second and third-hand information. But what we do know for sure is these surviving triplets and their families are furious that this study was done. They feel like it ruined their lives. Following the release of the documentary 3 Identical Strangers, Bobby and David were actually granted early access to the study that was sealed inside of Yale University. And when they looked at it, they were expecting to be blown away with the results. But it turned out it was over 10,000 pages of very technical information and much of it was heavily redacted. So they couldn't even read most of it. They were not able to deduce what the purpose of the study was in the first place or what it accomplished. It was just all very ambiguous. This study was ultimately shut down permanently in 1980, the same year the triplets discovered themselves. As for the adoption agency, Louise Wise Services, and all the scientists and researchers involved in the study, none of them were held accountable for their role in this totally unethical study. And so basically everything was swept under the rug. And so Bobby, David, and all of the family members of the triplets were just left with a whole bunch of questions, and not a lot of answers. On an early morning in December of 1991, a woman living in Largo, Florida, woke up to the sound of pounding on her front door. And as she climbed out of her bed, she realized it was not just pounding on her or she was hearing. Also, whoever was out there was screaming for help. When the woman realized there was some sort of crisis here, she kind of rushed and ran to the front door. She opened it up, and standing out on the front porch was her neighbor, and she was practically covered head to toe in blood. Her head was covered in gashes, her throat clearly had been slit. But before this woman could say what was even going on, she just fell to the ground and passed out. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the follow button is taking a well-deserved nap, make sure you immediately go over and wake him up with a leaf blower. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of December 14th, 1991, a 31-year-old man named Keith Young grabbed his car keys from a hook by the front door of his home in Largo, Florida. Behind him, his wife Anita slipped on her favorite pair of heels. The newlywed couple was about to head out on a much-needed date night. They were both actually on their second marriages, and they had 6 children between them from their previous relationships. So naturally, it was pretty hard to find time for just themselves. But that particular night, Keith's 2 kids were staying with their mother, who had shared custody, and Anita's 8-year-old daughter was at a sleepover. And her 12-year-old son, Jason, had agreed to stay home and watch his two younger siblings so that the adults could go out for dinner. Before they left, Keith gave Jason a final rundown of his expectations. Don't make too much of a mess. Make sure nobody gets hurt. And if there was an emergency, he'd written down the restaurant's phone number on a notepad in the kitchen. But Keith reminded Jason that if there were like a real emergency, like a true crisis, he should call 911 right away. And when he heard this, Jason, the 12-year-old, just kind of rolled his eyes and said, "Yeah, I got it. It's under control." Now, Keith knew he was actually being a little bit uptight here, but there'd been an attempted break-in at their house earlier that year, and he'd been on edge about leaving the kids home alone ever since. The intruder had actually cut their phone lines and then also taken off a window screen, and they'd also tried to break down a door as well. But they'd actually left without taking anything, and there hadn't been any more issues in the months since. But, critically, the suspect was never caught, so it felt kind of unresolved and scary for the family. Keith and Anita both hugged Jason goodbye as they walked out the door. And then, once the door closed behind them, Keith turned around and checked the handle to double-check that he locked it, just to be safe. Less than a half hour later, Keith and Anita sat down across from each other at the restaurant and unfolded their napkins onto their laps. They were excited to have a few hours of peace and quiet where they could just, focus on each other, something that didn't happen very often. The couple had gotten married earlier that year after meeting at a support group for single parents, and they were very grateful to have each other because their previous marriages were really not that great. Anita's ex-husband, Luther Bass, had a violent temper, and even though he now lived all the way across the country in Idaho, he still found a way to always complicate Anita's life. That summer, Luther had driven all the way to Keith and Anita's house to take his kids on a vacation, which Anita had initially agreed to. But when he showed up, he was unexpectedly driving a camper with his new girlfriend and her kids. And at that point, Anita had gotten a really bad feeling about the whole situation, and she actually started to worry that Luther would take her kids and then refuse to give them back. And so they had this big argument, and it got so bad that, actually, Anita had threatened to call the police before Luther finally backed off and left. Meanwhile, Keith had been having equally heated arguments with his ex-spouse, Linda, about whether their kids would spend the upcoming holidays with him or with Linda and her new husband, Steve. Things had gotten so nasty that Linda had actually recently begun harassing Anita over the phone and was also gearing up to go to court and try to get the custody agreement changed if Keith wouldn't agree to do things her way. But their bad relationships with their exes only made Keith more happy that he'd found Anita. He was glad that he could take care of her and her kids the way he felt like they deserved. So, despite all the tension hanging over them, he tried to keep the mood light and they enjoyed a very nice dinner. And then when the check came, Keith glanced at his watch and realized it was getting pretty late. He knew Anita's son Jason was a responsible kid and that he could definitely handle getting his younger siblings into bed. But Keith was still a bit worried about leaving the kids alone for too long. So he paid the check right away, and then he and Anita left the restaurant and drove home. A little while later, Keith and Anita pulled up outside of their brown single-story home. When they got inside, Keith was relieved to see that all the kids were calmly watching TV in the living room and the family cat was curled up on the couch right next to them. Keith told them that it was time to get ready for bed, and as 12-year-old Jason got up, Keith pulled him in for a big hug and told him he was proud of him for his hard work babysitting. Anita helped the younger kids brush their teeth, and then afterwards Keith turned off the lights and he went down the hall and said goodnight to all three kids, who slept in bunk beds in the same room. Then after that, he continued down the hallway to the main bedroom and climbed into bed with Anita. He kissed his wife goodnight and then turned off the light. Several hours later, around 3:00 a.m. early the next morning, Anita's 12-year-old son Jason awoke to a very loud noise. And when he heard it, he sat up in bed, and then he could hear something thumping around in the room next to him. But before he could figure out what was going on, someone screamed. With his vision still blurry from sleep, Jason slid off the top bunk and walked over to the door and cracked it open. And in the dark hallway, he could quickly make out the shadowy shapes of what appeared to be two men moving around, sort of struggling with each other. Fighting. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he realized that one of these men was his stepdad, Keith. But he couldn't make out anything about the other man except that he was really big and wearing what appeared to be a black ski mask. Jason immediately felt paralyzed by fear because he knew, this was obviously another intruder, just like the one who tried to break into their house that summer. For a second, he was hopeful that maybe his stepdad would fend the man off, but then Jason noticed there was blood sprayed all over the walls. And then, he saw the glint of a knife in the intruder's hand. The intruder had Keith pinned to the ground and was stabbing him over and over again. At the same moment, Jason saw his mother, Anita, run out of the master bedroom, also covered in blood. And she was holding a baseball bat and she swung it at the intruder. And she hit him in the back of the head, but it barely slowed him down. And that's when Jason heard his stepdad yell out for Anita to get the gun. And Anita! She ran into another room, and Jason just stood there looking out the crack, just paralyzed with shock, watching as this intruder literally picked Keith up and threw him back into the master bedroom. And the next thing Jason knew, he saw his mother standing in the hallway holding a gun, and the intruder was running away out the front door. Suddenly, Jason kind of snapped out of the shock trance he had found himself and unremembered what Keith had told him to do in case of a real emergency. Call 911. So, he ran to the phone in the kitchen. He picked it up and he dialed. But when he put the receiver to his ear, all he heard was silence. There was no dial tone. Jason looked over and he saw his mother kind of hobbling over towards him. She was standing in the doorway and there was blood visibly dripping down her neck. Jason's voice cracked when he told his mother that the phone line was dead. Anita told her son to go back with his stepdad and just wait, that she was going to go find help. And so Jason began to walk towards the bedroom where he knew his stepdad was, and as he did, he watched his mom run out the front door into the night. And then Jason, he went down the hallway and went into the bedroom where he saw his stepdad sprawled out on the bed. And he was still alive, but he was clearly struggling to breathe. He's kind of gasping and, gurgling. And Jason, this 12-year-old kid not having any idea how to handle this, just walked over to the bed, kneeled down, and he took Keith's hand and just held it while he waited for his mom. And as he held Keith's hand, he could hear the sound of his stepfather take his last few raspy breaths before he went completely limp. Several hours later, before dawn on the morning of December 15th, 1991, Detective Mike Short from the Largo Police Department pulled up to the curb outside of a brown single-story house surrounded by crime scene tape. He'd gotten a call from a supervisor who really didn't know much, just that an intruder had broken into this house and attacked a husband and wife while they slept. But now, as Short got out of his car and looked around at the quiet block of modest, well-kept houses, he found that kind of odd. This really wasn't a neighborhood where they saw violent home invasions. As Short walked up to the house, a uniformed officer caught up with him and gave him a few more details about what they knew so far. He said that the wife, Anita Young, had run to a neighbor's house screaming for help before passing out from blood loss in their front yard. And the husband, Keith Young, was deceased in the bedroom. The officer also said that the couple's 12-year-old son had woken up at some point and witnessed the attack. And for now, he was over at the neighbor's house until they could track down another guardian. The officer said that Anita had been taken to a hospital, but it would be a miracle if she survived. Her injuries were some of the worst they'd ever seen. As Short went up the walkway that led to the front door, he saw that blood had dripped all over the cement. The front door was open and right inside he saw a baseball bat lying on the floor with blood on the handle. Short stepped inside and he saw more blood that was spattered and smeared basically all over the living room, on the walls, the doors, the furniture, as if the suspect and the victims had been fighting all throughout the house. In fact, it was so chaotic and messy that Short thought maybe the suspect was not expecting to fight off two grown adults. Otherwise, they might have come up with a better plan of attack. So Short's first assumption was that this likely was a robbery that had gone terribly wrong. As he continued down the hallway, a cat ran past him. It was unharmed and it went to hide under the couch. The hallway was, somewhat unbelievably, even bloodier than the living room, with red smears all over the walls and floors. so Short figured most of the attack must have occurred here. Short reached the main bedroom and looked inside, and he saw Keith's body lying on the bed covered head to toe in blood. Keith's shirt was shredded, and Short could see there were multiple stab wounds to his chest and also a very deep gash down his side. Short decided not to actually go into the bedroom until crime scene techs had gone through it for forensic evidence. So instead, he just walked down the rest of the hallway and pushed open the door to another bedroom, where he was surprised to see the small children soundly asleep in their bunk beds. Somehow, these kids had slept through the entire attack. Short went back outside and immediately flagged down a uniformed officer, and he told him to go in there and wake up those kids and bring them somewhere safe. Then, once the officer went inside, Short pulled out his flashlight and began searching the yard for evidence. Based on Keith's wounds, at least what he saw, Short thought he was probably attacked with a knife or maybe even an axe or a machete. But apart from that bloody baseball bat that was found in the doorway, there was no sign of a weapon anywhere inside or outside of the house. But as Short went around the side of the house, he found something else that was interesting. The home's phone lines had clearly been cut. The killer must have planned ahead to make sure nobody in this house could call out for help. And this was interesting because nothing else about the scene suggested that this crime was carefully planned. In fact, in some ways, you could say it looked like it was very unplanned. But now Short had to consider that maybe this was not just a random robbery gone wrong. Maybe, especially given the cut phone lines, this was like a premeditated attack, a premeditated murder. And if that was the case, he had to figure out who the intended target was, Keith or Anita, or both. A little while later, Detective Short walked up the street to the neighbor's house to speak with his best eyewitness, Anita's 12-year-old son, Jason. After Short knocked on the door, the neighbors let him inside and showed him into their living room, where he saw Jason was wrapped in a blanket and still wearing his pajamas. Short sat down across from him and told him that he knew it must be extremely difficult to talk about this, but he really needed to know exactly what he had seen and what he had heard during this attack. Tears began to roll down Jason's face as he began to describe watching his mother and stepfather fight off this intruder. Jason said he couldn't really describe what this person looked like because they were wearing a ski mask, but he was pretty sure it was a man. He also said there had been a little bit of skin exposed on the killer's neck, and from the looks of it, it appeared like their skin was maybe fairly dark. So Short wrote down that the suspect likely had dark skin, but because it was dark and Jason clearly had not gotten a very good look at the killer, he knew the boy could be wrong too, so he was just putting it down as a maybe. Short asked Jason if the intruder had said anything during the attack, and Jason just shook his head and said, no. He said the intruder didn't say a single word the entire time, and Short made note of that too, because it made him wonder if maybe the killer was someone close to the family, and they knew that if they spoke, someone might recognize their voice, like Jason. Later that same morning, once the sun had come up, Short went back to Keith and Anita's house and searched the outside of the property again, in case he missed anything when it was dark. And while he was searching the front yard, another police cruiser pulled up to the curb. An officer got out and walked over to Short. She asked if he was the lead investigator on this case, and when he said he was, the officer told him that she'd been waiting at the hospital all morning and Anita had finally woken up enough to say a few words. She said Anita was only awake for just a few minutes before she had to be rushed back into surgery, but it was long enough to answer a couple of questions. Anita had described waking up to see a man standing over her with an axe in one hand and a knife in the other. She said it was a man that she had never seen before. She didn't recognize anything about him. The officer said right before Anita was taken off to surgery, there was one more thing she mentioned. There had been an attempted break-in at their house earlier that year, and the intruder during that break-in had also cut their phone lines. Short instinctively turned and literally looked at the side of the house where those lines had been cut, and he thought to himself, this is too strange of a coincidence to be ignored. Later that day back at the station, Short read through reports on the interviews his team had done with Keith and Anita's kids and their neighbors. A team of 5 detectives had been assigned to this case, and they've made quick progress on collecting background information on the victims. Everybody in the neighborhood had described the victims as being a very normal, happy couple. Keith was an air conditioning technician who'd been working at the same company for a very long time. and Anita was mostly a stay-at-home mom who did some accounting work on the side. However, what also came out in these interviews was that both Keith and Anita had ex-spouses who could potentially want to hurt them. Anita's ex-husband, Luther, lived thousands of miles away in Boise, Idaho. But Short knew that despite the distance, it was not impossible that he might have traveled to Florida to commit this crime. So Short called the Boise police and told them about this attack and asked them to track down Luther and question him. As for Keith's ex-wife, Linda, Short had learned that she actually lived right there in town, and Keith's 2 kids were still at her house unaware that their father was dead. And since Linda and her new husband, Steve, were potential suspects, Short wanted to be the one to break the news to them to see how they all reacted. So he looked up Linda's address in the database and then grabbed his keys and headed out. Less than an hour later, Short parked his car in Linda's driveway and walked up to the front door. He knocked and the woman opened the door, and Short asked her if she was Linda, and she said yes. And then he flashed his badge and said he'd like to come in. And Linda, she seemed a bit confused, but she opened the door and let him inside. Short walked into what seemed like a perfectly normal Sunday morning routine inside of the house. The air smelled like eggs and bacon, and the 2 kids were in the living room watching cartoons with a man who Short figured must be Linda's new husband, Steve. And so Short, he asked Steve to leave the kids and come into the kitchen with he and Linda, because he wanted to speak to both of them. And then, once all 3 of them had sat down at the kitchen table, Short broke the news that Keith had been murdered. And then Short watched as Linda literally collapsed into Steve's arms. Short gave him a minute, but then he cut right to the chase and he asked where Linda and Steve had been at about 3:00 a.m. that morning. Linda seemed shocked to realize that clearly, the detective was considering both her and her husband as suspects. But she choked out that they'd both been at home with the kids sleeping, and Steve just nodded in agreement. He said they'd all been home together all night. That was it. Nothing about their demeanor or their reactions was suspicious to Short. But when he pressed Linda about what her relationship with her ex-husband was like, she admitted that it was contentious and that, actually, just a couple of days earlier, she'd spoken to a lawyer about potentially changing their custody agreement. Short found the timing of this a little convenient, and he wondered, maybe Linda or Steve had decided they would just settle the custody battle by simply taking Keith out of the picture for good. And he also found it convenient that Linda and Keith's 2 kids weren't at Keith's house when the attack happened. It was only Anita's kids who were there at the time. But Short thanked the couple for their time and told them he would be in touch if he had any more questions. And then he left their house. And as he got into his car and drove back to the station, he kept going over the conversation he had just had in his mind. Linda and Steve's alibis were pretty weak. They seemed to be the only 2 people who could vouch for their whereabouts for the night of the murder. And so what that meant was Short had every reason to keep both of them at the very top of his suspect list. Late that night, Short was sitting at his desk in his office when his phone rang. He picked it up and it was the police in Boise, Idaho. They'd managed to track down Anita's ex-husband, Luther. Short immediately sat up straight and grabbed a pencil to take notes. The officer on the line told him that when they'd gotten to Luther's house, he wasn't there, but his fiancée, Connie, was. And she told them that he'd been out on a weekend hunting trip. So the officers had gone out and searched for Luther in the area where he said he'd been hunting, but they didn't find him until that evening when Luther actually arrived back at his house. The officer said, at that point they took him in for questioning, and he had told them the same thing that Connie had told Connie, that he'd been out elk hunting about an hour away from Boise all weekend. Luther had been able to describe, basically, every step of his hunting trip in great detail. But, since he had been hunting alone, there was nobody to corroborate his alibi. Now Short knew that the drive from Boise to Largo, Florida, where the attack took place, took at least 3 or 4 days. So the fact that Luther was in Boise less than 24 hours after the murders meant that he could not have driven there. But there was still a possibility that, if he was involved, maybe he could have flown. Now Short knew it would be difficult, but not impossible, for Luther to catch a plane to Florida and back during the time that he was supposedly out hunting. So he told the Boise officer to look into whether Luther had recently purchased an airline ticket and to also take saliva, blood, and hair samples from Luther. After Short hung up the phone, he just sat back in his chair and thought for a second. It was less than 24 hours into this investigation, and Short already had 3 suspects in his crosshairs: Keith's ex-wife Linda and Linda's new husband Steve, and also Anita's ex-husband Luther. And then also to some degree Luther's fiancée, Connie, could have been involved. But based on logistics and the fact that she was at the house, it seemed unlikely. But there is one big problem. Based on Anita and Jason's eyewitness testimony, the suspect they were looking for was a dark-skinned man who Anita had never met before. And that description would not apply to any of their suspects. Short knew that the suspect description might not be reliable. After all, it had been dark in the house, so Jason could have been wrong about the killer's skin color, and Anita was barely conscious during her interview, so her recollections might not be accurate at all. But if it was accurate, it could mean any number of things for Short's investigation. It could mean it was a random robbery after all, just some random person who went in the house and did this horrible thing. It could also mean that, one of his current suspects had maybe hired somebody to commit the crime. Or it could mean that all Short's theories about the case were just completely wrong and he had no idea what happened. Short shrugged his eyes and looked at the clock and realized it was almost midnight, so he decided it was time to go home and get some sleep. Maybe he hoped by morning a new piece of evidence might turn up that would help point him in the right direction. Around 7 a.m. the next morning, so about 28 hours after Keith's murder, Short pulled into the parking lot of Pinecrest Golf Course, which was less than a mile away from Keith and Anita's house. And at this very moment, Short was feeling really optimistic about the case because a groundskeeper at this golf course had called the police that morning and said they'd found a ski mask and a glove lying in the grass. So now Short got out of his car and he went into the clubhouse, and the groundskeeper was there waiting for him. And he said he had left the ski mask and the glove right outside, right where he had found them. So Short followed the groundskeeper out onto the course, and as they walked, Short made note of all the ponds scattered around and also the lake at the park right across the street. He wondered if maybe the killer might have tossed their weapon or weapons into the water. A minute later, the groundskeeper stopped walking and pointed down at the ground at a black ski mask and a dark-colored cotton glove lying in the grass exactly as promised. And so Short put on a pair of latex gloves and he knelt down and he carefully lifted up the mask, and as he did, he felt that clearly it was crusted with something reddish-brown, very likely dried blood. As soon as Short got back to the station, he sent the mask and the glove off to the crime lab for testing, hoping that they might find a trace of the killer's DNA. Then Short spoke to his supervisor about sending a team of divers out to search the water at the golf course and also the park in case the murder weapons had been disposed of in any of those water bodies. It seemed like a long shot that they would actually find something, but it was the best lead they had so far, and finding the weapon or weapons could really help them narrow down their suspect list. And by the time Short got back to his desk, he saw that his answering machine was blinking. There was a new message. So he hit play, and the message was from a man who said he had information on the Keith Young case. So Short called him back right away, and when the man answered, he said he was a college student who lived a block away from Keith and Anita Young's house. And he said on the night of the murder, he and his friends had been hanging out in his driveway and they'd seen a man jogging east down Coronet Avenue. Short immediately turned and looked at the map on the wall, and he got really excited because he saw Coronet Avenue was actually the exact path the killer would have had to take to get from Keith and Anita's house to that golf course. Short asked the young man to describe this jogger, and the college student said that it appeared to be a white man with short dark hair. Short asked him if he was pretty sure about that, and the student said yeah. In fact, the jogger had passed under a streetlight at one point, so they all got a pretty good look. This was a huge development since 12-year-old Jason, one of the eyewitnesses, had said the killer had dark skin. It was very possible now that maybe Jason was wrong, but it was also possible that there were now 2 men involved in the attack. Maybe one had dark skin and one had light skin. The following week, Short opened up a folder that had just been sent over from the police in Northport, Florida, a town 85 miles away. On December 19th, so just 4 days after Keith Young was murdered, a man and 3 kids in Northport, Florida, were shot to death in the middle of the night inside of their home. The suspects in that attack were two men wearing ski masks, and they had cut the house's phone lines. So the similarities between these two killings were easy to see. But as far as Short could tell, the victims in the second attack didn't have any connections to the Youngs. Plus, the victims in the second attack had been shot instead of stabbed. And so, as Short really did try to look for all the similarities he could between the two crime scenes, he just couldn't get over how sort of blatantly personal the very violent and bloody attack felt at the Youngs' house. So, even though there was this other, on the surface similar killing in Florida, and even though Jason and Anita both swore they did not recognize the intruder, Short was not ready to rule out that Keith Young had been killed by someone who knew him. His strongest suspect was still Anita's ex-husband, Luther, who claimed to have been out hunting alone at the time of the attack. As for Anita, her condition had actually finally stabilized, and when Short had gone to speak to her at the hospital, she had said that Luther was really the only person she could think of who might want to hurt her, because they'd been arguing a lot about custody and also child support. But the Boise police had checked with every airline in the country, and none of them had a record of Luther flying into Florida that weekend. So Short couldn't even prove that Luther was in the state at the time of the attack. And then also Anita had mentioned that she'd been having problems with Keith's ex-wife, Linda. She said that Linda had been harassing her all summer long, calling her so many times that she couldn't even use her own phone. Short definitely still had his eye on Linda, but he still hadn't found anything directly linking Linda or her new husband, Steve, to the crime. But Short was still very hopeful that this case would get solved because a preliminary report from the forensics lab had just come in that said a Caucasian hair had been discovered inside the black ski mask that was found on the golf course, which could point to any one of Short's main suspects. And Short knew it was only a matter of time before the forensics lab finished its full analysis of that hair sample, and then they would know for sure if it was an exact match. One day in early January of 1992, so a few weeks after Keith's murder, Detective Short got into the office and checked his answering machine, and he found that he had gotten a message from the forensics lab telling him to call back right away. And so right away he picked up the phone and dialed the number, and he could feel his heart pounding as the line rang. This could finally be the break in the case he'd been waiting for. And when the technician picked up, he told Short that, they had analyzed that hair in the mask and they had analyzed the DNA. But it was not a match for Short's top suspect, Anita's ex-husband Luther. Not a match. Short thanked the technician and hung up feeling very disappointed. Now this still didn't fully rule Luther out, especially because Short still thought there might have been maybe the suspects involved. But he decided that at this point it was time for investigators to really focus on other possibilities. Several weeks later, so in early 1992, roughly a couple of months after Keith Young's murder, Detective Short knocked on the front door of Linda's house. Linda is Keith's ex-wife. And when Linda opened the door and saw the detective once again standing outside her house, she quickly let him inside. The house was quiet and Linda told Short that she was the only one home. They sat down in the living room and then they ran through all the subjects that Short had grilled her on the first time around. Her alibi, her custody disputes, her tense relationship with Keith. And none of her answers changed, and she really didn't say anything that could be viewed as incriminating. But as their conversation began to wrap up, Linda looked anxious, like there was something more she wanted to say. Short asked her what was going on, and she said that there was something she hadn't mentioned when they had spoken the first time. It was about her new husband, Steve. She said that a while back, after she and Steve had gotten married, that briefly she had rekindled her relationship with Keith. Steve had found out that she was cheating on him and he was naturally very upset. Linda said that a few months ago, Steve had even made a few jokes about hurting Keith. At the time she didn't think he was serious, but after Keith was killed, she started worrying that Steve might have somehow been involved. She said that she had even gone so far as to check Steve's knife collection to make sure none of them were missing. Short was careful not to let his shock come across his face, but inside his mind was absolutely spinning. He'd always thought it was possible that Linda and Steve were both in on the murder, but now it sounded like maybe Steve might have acted alone. He also wondered, though, if Linda was ratting out her husband to draw suspicion away from herself. So, to help get to the bottom of it, he asked Linda to come with him back to the station for a polygraph test. He also planned to order another polygraph for Steve, who was suddenly at the very top of his suspect list. But almost 2 months later, in March of 1992, Short was back in his office staring down at a pile of documents he'd already read over 1,000,000 times, and the evidence still didn't point him toward anybody in particular. Linda and Steve had both taken their polygraph tests, but the results did not indicate they were guilty, and there was still no hard evidence that tied either of them to the crime. Also, after searching all the ponds in that lake in the area, police still had not found a murder weapon, and they'd still not been able to match that strand of hair from the presumed killer's ski mask to any of the suspects on their radar. Short still had really 3 main suspects who could have been responsible for the murder. There was Keith's ex-wife Linda, who had been fighting with him about custody. Her alibi was weakened only supported by her new husband Steve, who she had been suspicious of when Short interviewed her for a second time. And so Steve was also one of his primary suspects because he had this, terrible history with Keith and had even openly joked about, Hart and Keith. And then there was Luther, Anita's hot-headed ex-husband who lived on the other side of the country. Now it would have been possible for him to fly from Idaho to Florida and commit this crime, but there was no proof that he did. And of course, there was still the possibility that this was just a random attack or a robbery gone wrong. And investigators still couldn't even be sure if they were looking for 1 or 2 or more suspects. They had no idea. So Short had plenty of theories, but still no evidence to back any of them up. The investigation had gone so cold that the task force assigned to the case had been reduced from 5 detectives to just two. Short was starting to fear that Keith's murder might never be solved. But just then Short's phone rang, and when he picked up the receiver, a voice said that they knew something about that previous breaking attempt at Keith and Anita's house a few months before Keith's murder. And as Detective Short listened to what this caller had to say, he suddenly knew exactly who had broken into that house and killed Keith and tried to kill Anita. Based on all the collected evidence as well as the killer's eventual partial confession, this is what investigators believe happened to Keith and Anita Young on the morning of December 15th, 1991 at 3:00 a.m. The killer saw that all the windows in Keith and Anita's house were dark, so they carefully snuck around the side of the home and cut the phone lines, just like they'd done a few months before. The first time, they'd second-guessed themselves and didn't go through with what they had planned. But this time was going to be different. The killer broke into the house very easily, feeling very calm and in control. They had an axe in their right hand and a knife in their left. As they made their way through the living room, they heard growling and hissing, and they looked down to see the family's cat standing in their path. They thought about strangling the cat to shut it up, but decided not to. They wanted to do this with as little collateral damage as possible, so they bent down and tried to soothe the cat. And when it worked and the cat became quiet, the killer stepped past the cat and began walking down the hall. They made it to the master bedroom. They opened up the door and stepped inside. Anita and Keith were fast asleep in their beds. And so, the killer quietly walked over to the side of the bed that Anita was on, and they stood there looking down at her, getting ready to do what they felt like they had to do. But as the killer was looking down at Anita stirred awake, and for a brief second she looked up and locked eyes with the killer. And the killer instinctively just swung the axe down, hitting Anita squarely in the head. But she fought back, and she shouted out Keith's name to wake him up. And the next thing the killer knew, Keith was on top of them, pulling them away from Anita. And so the killer began hitting Keith with the axe as well. But even despite being hit about 3 times, Keith would not let up. And so they struggled and shoved each other, and their fight kind of spilled out of the bedroom into the main portion of the house. I mean, this was not how the killer had hoped this would go. They'd wanted to get this done quickly and leave without anybody waking up. But they clearly underestimated Keith. No matter how many times the killer stabbed him or hacked at him with the axe, he didn't stop fighting. And then, as the killer and Keith continued sort of fumbling around and making their way back down the hallway, the killer suddenly felt something hard smash into the back of their skull, and they turned to see Anita standing there behind them with blood running down her face and a baseball bat in her hands. The killer heard Keith shout out for Anita to go get the gun, and he saw Anita run toward a nearby closet. The killer also noticed a young boy looking out from a doorway nearby. And so the killer made a split-second decision. They just grabbed Keith and chucked him into the master bedroom. And then the killer sprinted back down the hallway and out the front door. And then when they got to the sidewalk, they removed their ski mask and kind of casually jogged down the street, hoping that to anybody looking outside they would think the killer was just, an unassuming health nut out for a very early morning running. When they got to a nearby golf course, they stopped on the grass to change their clothes, and then after that they stole a bike and drove away. Things had not gone the way the killer had hoped. But as they reflected on what they had just done, they thought to themselves that, in reality, this actually could have gone worse. I mean, they didn't kill the cat and, critically, no kids had been hurt either. And in some ways, that's what this was all about, to avoid hurting the kids. Because the killer was Anita's ex-husband, Luther Bass. He wanted to get Anita out of the way so he could have custody of their four kids and treat them the way he believed they needed to be treated. And he'd wanted to get Anita out of the way so that he could have custody of his four kids. He felt like she was screwing up their lives, that he was the kid's solution, they needed him, and so he had to do this. But Luther's own fiancée, Connie, had ultimately told the Boise police that Luther was the one who had cut Keith and Anita's phone lines a few months back before the murder. And she said she knew Luther had actually flown to Florida on the weekend of the murder, using an alias and fake social security number that he had gotten from his co-worker. And once the Boise police finished speaking with Connie, they immediately called Detective Short in Florida to tell him what they just learned. It turned out there was no second suspect. It was just Luther. So 12-year-old Jason had just been wrong about the killer's appearance, and Anita had been wrong about knowing who they were. As for that hair that had been found inside the black ski mask that Luther had been wearing, it's unclear how that was there. It wasn't Luther's hair. But it's possible that maybe somebody else had put the mask on at some point, and that's how it got there. Luther Bass was arrested in Boise, Idaho, on March 6, 1992, and he confessed to the crime on the same day. A year later, he was convicted of first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, and burglary with an assault. He was sentenced to life plus 30 years in prison. As for Anita, she would recover from her injuries. A quick note about our stories: they're all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved. And some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.